So good. So good to be back here on this beautiful summer day. Thank you for inviting me back. And we have an exciting course, I believe, this summer semester that begins with a discovery that was made recently and has now been published. But before I introduce that discovery, let me put all of this in context. After so many years of excluding women from ordained leadership as priests in many churches, the Catholic Church, for example, still to this day, in the 1980s, 3 New Testament scholars began a project of retrieval of the role of women in early Christianity. All of these books date from the 1980s. The earliest one is by the famous Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza at Harvard. She's still going strong at the age of 89, has not yet retired, and is still mentoring PhD students. Her book was called In Memory of Her. So you'll recognize that the title is taken from the gospel story, what Jesus said about the woman who anointed him. We will talk about that text next week when we look at women leaders as referenced in the Gospels. So, Schussler Fiorenza, this was a breakthrough. She tried to retrieve the importance of the role of women in early Christianity. My favorite of these 3 books is by a friend of mine. She passed away recently, is Louisa Schottroff, a German who taught in San Francisco for most of her career. The book is called Lydia's Impatient Sisters, and it is a social history of women in early Christianity and in the ancient world. And we will talk about Lydia today, who is mentioned in the book of Acts. The 3rd book, Antoinette Clark Wire, who teaches also in San Francisco and is also still going strong. Her book is called The Corinthian Women Prophets. And we will also talk about that text later today, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So ever since the 1980s, scholars have devoted more effort to retrieving the role of women in the origins of Christianity. Now, those projects of retrieval were largely limited to textual analysis. So the close reading of the Gospels and Paul's letters, sometimes reading those letters against the grain of the text, analyzing the rhetoric and trying to hear the voices of the women that were talked about by Paul and male leaders. But what happened recently is that an archaeologist from Vanderbilt University, the chairman of the Department of Mediterranean and Classical Studies, a good friend of mine. In fact, Diane and I will be with him at a conference in Belgium toward the end of July. His name is Joseph Reif. And together with Elena Korka, who represented the Greek Archaeological Society, they spent the years 2007 until 2014 carefully excavating an area on the Kotsungila Ridge north of the eastern port city of Roman Corinth, a place called King. And if I could ever get a traveling seminar and take the people of Epiphany with me, that is a place that we would visit. It has been excavated In the port city itself, you would find a temple to Isis, as well as the ruins of beautiful villas from the time of Paul. Well, you can see that the excavations took, 7 years? And then it took 8 years to publish the book. This is volume 1 of a 2-volume set, and it is magnificent. The detail included. I'm going to pass it around so that you can have a sense of what this book is like. And the reason I'm so excited about it is that finally we have archaeological evidence of the importance of women leaders in early Christianity. It came in the form of a discovery made by Joe Wright and his team on the Cotsundila Ridge. Initially, they found a number of burials, and the burials displayed the social composition of the community. Some of the burials were richly decorated chamber tombs. Others were simple shaft graves for more humble citizens. But as they moved down the ridge toward the harbor, and if you'll bring up the picture, it's on your handout as well, you'll see that the first images on your handout show an aerial view of the harbor at Kincrae. Kincrae is the eastern port city of Roman Corinth. It looks out into the Aegean Sea. And if you're sailing from Athens to Corinth, this is where you would come. And you can see that it was a beautifully constructed harbor. These two arms here that protect the ships that come in are called moles. And you can see that originally there were large buildings along the wharf near the dock. This is what you would see today because these moles, the arms have subsided into the water. You can just barely see them underneath the water. The ridge that was so carefully excavated by Joe Wright and his team runs along a little road that leads up. Can you see that road leading up here? A little road leading up along the very top of the ridge. Well, as they worked their way down the ridge back toward the port, they began to discover the remains of big, beautiful villas dated to the time of Paul, the 1st century. In the book that I passed around, if you page through it, you'll see beautiful mosaics that were in the floor of those villas. The most spectacular discovery was the discovery of the remains of a large octagonal, so 8-sided monument. The monument stood almost 3 stories high. It was at a prominent place along the ridge from which sailors coming into the port would have seen the monument. So it was clearly advertising the importance of an individual. As Joseph Wright and his team began excavating, they soon discovered buried in the foundation, and now can we scroll through the handout down to the last page? They discovered buried in the foundation of the monument a treasure trove of artifacts that had been carefully deposited there at the time when the monument was consecrated and dedicated. 13 lamps, many of them with clearly Christian symbols, crosses. 13 coins, that had been carefully selected to represent the reigns of different rulers through history. And finally, a flask with holy oil. They found this deposit buried in the foundation of the building when it was consecrated. So, as you could imagine, Joseph Reif and the archaeologists began asking themselves, why the number 13? What is the significance of that number? The number 13 represents a canonical number, 12. The 12 what? Apostles. Plus what? 1. 12 plus 1, 13. So they began to ask themselves, is it possible that this monument commemorates a person who was understood to be a 13th apostle? A supernumerary addition to the canonical 12. Well, they continued excavating, and they discovered the foundations and some of the supporting pillars of this beautiful octagon. And now, if we can scroll back up to the second and third images, they portray the artist's reconstruction of the building. And you can see how beautiful it is, how beautifully constructed. All around the monument were burials, large burials of people who wanted to be laid to rest in proximity to this monument. Now, if you scroll up one more time, you can see the artist's reconstruction of the interior of the octagon with a beautiful mosaic floor, light coming in through these windows, a different kind of floor around the transept, and large pillars bearing the weight of the ceiling. So Joseph Reif and his colleagues began asking themselves, to whom could this monument have been dedicated? Whose memorial does this represent? They ruled out a local bishop because none of the clerical leaders of King were notable or famous in early Christian history. And in fact, there is only one early Christian known from Kincrae who might have been the subject of this monument, and that is the famous Phoebe, who is mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 to 2, where Paul composes a recommendation for Phoebe. Now, before we look at that text, I need to tell you one more thing about this octagonal monument. Below the monument itself, the archaeologists discovered the remains of a beautiful first century house, a villa. And so in this book that I've passed around, Joseph Reif and his colleagues suggest they can't do more than that because there aren't any stones that say Phoebe was here. But what they suggest and what they argue in some detail is that this monument was dedicated to the famous deaconess and benefactress of early Christianity, Phoebe, and that the monument was built on top of what? Her home, her first century home. Now, the monument itself dates to the late 3rd, early 4th century. So by this time, the Christian community had become wealthier, had resources. And of course, Phoebe was, the story of her life was famous by this time. In fact, there is another monument in Jerusalem that commemorates the benefactions of a woman who is described as a Deuterophebe. Greek students, the second Phoebe. So her fame, her story had spread all the way to Jerusalem. So Joseph Reif and his team argue that this monument commemorated Phoebe and that it was built on top of her home, which was the location of an early Christian house church. Now, to go back to those 13 lamps, the 13 coins, and the flask of holy oil. In this book, Joseph Wright and his colleagues seek to reconstruct and to imagine the ritual by which the building would have been dedicated and consecrated. They picture 13 women, or perhaps 26, 13 carrying the lamps, 13 carrying the coins, and one person, the leader, carrying a flask of holy oil. And Joseph Wright imagines what it would have been like for this group to make the little short pilgrimage, a procession from the harbor up the Kotsungila Ridge on the day when the monument was dedicated, and then to carefully deposit in the foundation stone these artifacts. So Phoebe is presented as the 13th apostle, a person who is added to the original group of the 12. Now, at the beginning of your handout, before we look at that text, I should just say that what Joseph Wright and his team discovered is the most, in my opinion, sensational discovery related to Pauline Christianity. So the earliest period for which we have text, literature. Nothing this important has been discovered ever before. And I was so proud of my friend Joseph Reif that he had the courage to follow the path of clues, right? To draw the inference that this was a monument dedicated to Phoebe and that it was built on top of her house. More skeptical and secular historians might have been reluctant to draw that conclusion. It's not popular anymore in university circles to be a Christian, but Joseph Wright had the courage to do that. And it's all published there in the book. Now, the person to whom this monument then was apparently dedicated is mentioned by Paul at the end of Paul's great epistle to the Romans. Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. I commend to you our sister, so she is definitely a Christian, Phoebe. And then it says a deacon of the ecclesia, the assembly at King-Creae. Now this word diakonos in Greek, later in Christian history, the deacon represents an established church office, subordinate to the elders or presbyters, the overseers. But at this early period, in the middle of the first century, if you look at Paul's use of the Greek word diakonos, it is not limited to a secondary officer with practical responsibilities. The word would be better translated minister. In fact, Paul uses this word to describe himself. He is a diakonos to Jesu Christi, a minister of Jesus Christ. And then Paul tells us something more. So that you may receive or welcome her in the Lord as it is fitting for the saints. This letter, Romans, was sent to the Christian groups in the capital of the world, Rome. But many scholars, including me, believe that a copy of this letter was sent back by Paul to Ephesus, which had been the center of Paul's mission work throughout the 15 years when he was establishing Christian communities. I think Romans 16, this chapter, was attached to the epistle to the Romans as a cover letter to introduce and commend Phoebe. Why do I believe that? Why do many other scholars believe it, including my mentor at Harvard, Helen Kester? Because in this letter, Paul sends greetings. He sends greetings to more than 30 Christians, more than 30 colleagues with whom Paul had worked, his missionary team, so to speak. How could these people be in Rome, a place that Paul had never visited and where he had never spread the gospel? It's much more plausible that all of these 30 people were located in his former missionary headquarters, Ephesus. So, Paul is sending a copy of his letter to the Romans, his most expansive and systematic account of his understanding of the Christ event. He is sending a copy of that letter back to Ephesus, and he attaches to it a cover letter, the purpose of which is to commend Phoebe and then to greet his former colleagues and co-workers. Now, look at the final thing that he tells us about her. And help her in whatever way she may require from you. So evidently Phoebe is traveling, perhaps traveling on business, because we are about to discover that Phoebe had more than a small income. She has a substantial amount of money. Help her in whatever way she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. Now, this Greek word that's translated benefactor is the word prostatis. Can you say that with me? In ancient Greek, it designates a patroness. It is the feminine form of the noun prostates. So the patron of a city or an organization. Wow. This woman has a substantial enough fortune to have served as a patroness of many, and also of what? Paul himself. Paul has just introduced the Christian woman who bankrolled his work as an apostle around the Mediterranean. And what he says about her here coincides with what the archaeologists discovered at King Crea. That big, beautiful Roman villa beneath the monument. They've only excavated part of it. The villa is located on the very edge of the ridge, the edge of the cliff. And with the passage of time and the rising and falling of the sea level, parts of the villa have subsided into the sea, along with the eastern wall of the octagon. Now that's important because if the eastern wall of the octagon had survived, what do you think they might have found underneath the floor of the octagon? They might have found her tomb. You're exactly right, John.
Probably an altar.
Right. Right. And Joseph Wright actually suggests that in the book. He said, we were unable to recover a tomb, but it is likely that there was one, and that it subsided underneath the eastern wall. Wow. What an exciting discovery. Yeah, this is a big wow. There's no doubt I would take the whole class there if we can organize a visiting journey. Yes, John.
Is there any chance that it's in the water?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In fact, things can be recovered from the water, even when they have been submerged beneath the silt and the mud. I told you that they discovered a temple to Isis down in the harbor. Okay. When Diane and I visited King Creai for the first time, when we were young students in Germany, back in the early 1980s, in the little museum that they have built there, we saw the reconstructed, beautiful stained glass windows depicting the goddess Isis and scenes from the River Nile in Egypt. And those beautiful glass windows had been buried beneath the ocean. They subsided with the southern mold of the harbor. But the archaeologists were able to dig them out. And if you go there someday, you'll see them. Like those beautiful glass windows. So it is possible that if the Greek government permits them to resume the excavations, and if they are able to dig beneath the water, who knows what they may find. It's possible. Other questions? Yes.
So it seems to me that among some of the more conservative folks, they want to translate this deacon, this Greek deacon as servant. So is that just a misreading?
No, it's not a misreading. A diakonos is a servant, right? It is a servant, but the proper understanding of a word does not depend upon the etymological root. Now, the etymological root of diakonos means servant. But if you've studied language, you know that the meaning of a word is determined by what? Usage. Usage. Exactly right. Exactly right. So in order to determine what Paul means, when he uses this word, the first thing that a responsible scholar does is to look at Paul's other uses of the word diakonos. He uses it a few times. At the beginning of his letter to the Philippians, Paul sends greetings to the presbyters and the deacons. So they are clearly officers, right, in charge of the Christ group. Later, Paul uses the word diakonos to describe himself. In 2 Corinthians 3, Paul says that he is the diakonos of the kaine, the new covenant that God made with people in Jesus Christ. So, yes, etymologically, the word means servant. But if it's important to retrieve what Paul means when he uses the word, then it's not just a person that renders subordinate help, but it is either an officer of some kind or a minister. A minister is the way I would translate. Now, but to go back to that text for a minute and talk a little bit about the richness and the ambiguity of these words. It's not only the word diakonos that can mean servant, minister, deacon. This other word that's translated benefactor, prostatis. Prostatis, if you look at the usage of the word, it means patroness or benefactress, but etymologically, right? Prostatis. Pro is a prefix preposition that means what? Before, in front of. Stasis is what? Someone standing. So this word prostatis literally means, or the Latin equivalent of it is president. The person who stands before the congregation. I know, your jaw just drops, doesn't it? The person who stands before the worshiping community. So to my conservative colleagues, I would say, okay, if you want to go with the root meaning, the etymological meaning of deacon as servant, then you should at least be consistent and allow that prostotis can mean what? President. But it's not the etymological meaning that is significant, it's the usage. And look how Paul uses it here. It wouldn't make any sense to translate it president here. She is the president of many and of myself as well? No. She is the patroness, the benefactress of many and of myself as well. Good question. Good question. Other comments, questions?
Do we know where she got her money?
Probably business. Thank you, John. She might have inherited it. I mean, the short answer is we don't know, right? The beauty of the villa that Joseph Wright and his colleagues uncovered shows how wealthy she was. The mosaics in the floor. Where did she get that money? She might have inherited it. But the wealth of King Creon came from what? Commerce and trade. Remember, what kind of little city was King Creon? A port, right? Joseph Wright calls his book On the Edge of a Roman Port. So if you wanted to ship goods from the east, from what is today Turkey or Syria, and if you wanted those things to go to Rome, it was dangerous to try to navigate the Cape of Malaya, the southern part of Greece, the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Sailors refused to navigate that during the winter because of the storms, and there are lots of shipwrecks down there for archaeologists to find today. Instead, what they did was this. The isthmus that connected the Peloponnesus to the mainland of Greece was so narrow that it was more practical to sail your ship into King Creon, offload your cargo, put it on a wagon, and have the wagon dragged or pulled across the isthmus to the other port city, the western port city of Lycaon. And then it sailed on to Rome. Now, guess what the archaeologists have discovered? You can see this for yourself when we go there. They have found the stone pavement of the Diolkos, that ancient railroad track that connected the two port cities. And you can even see the ruts of wagon wheels in the stone from the thousands of vehicles that were dragged across there. So the wealth of King Creon came from trade and commerce. And I think the most plausible scenario for Phoebe's wealth is that she was somehow involved in trade. That's probably why she is on her way to Ephesus, right? And Paul is giving a letter to commend her to Christians there. She's probably traveling for commerce. Women were involved in commerce. Women couldn't run for political office in the first century, but they were increasingly active in business. Has anyone here been to Pompeii? Good. On the Forum at Pompeii, the largest temple, the temple of Augustus, the imperial cult, was built and dedicated by a woman named Mamia. How did she make her money? Did you learn that when you went there? Brick manufacturing. She owned a company that manufactured bricks. And there are lots of examples of women like that. Pompeia Agrippinilla, for example, and others. So women were making money in business and commerce. Yes, Jim.
Well, as part of your thought process with this, the fact that a woman inheriting money, if there were other family involved, was unlikely that she would have control over it.
Yes, she would only have, according to Roman law,
Right.
law professor, she would only have had control if her father had given her the money and if her husband died.
And there were no descendants.
and there were no male descendants.
So you narrowed it down to a really unlikely
Right.
possibility of inheritance.
Right. Were there rich women like that who fulfilled this unlikely possibility? Yes. The famous woman, the mother of the Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, Cornelia. Her husband died. Her two sons, the John and Robert Kennedy of the Roman Republic, they were both assassinated by the oligarchs. And so Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, inherited everything. It was the fortune of the Scipios. And you can still see the ruins of her incredible villa on the northern side of the Bay of Naples. So there were women like that, but they are very rare. Very rare. Another case, Cicero married a wealthy woman. Then Cicero got into trouble in politics and was exiled from Rome. Well, his wealthy wife exercised a provision of Roman law that allowed her to divorce Cicero and take back her dowry. So she took all the money back. And Cicero was forced to marry the billionaire daughter of 17 years old in order to restore his fortune. He married a young girl. But his wife divorced him in order to reclaim the dowry. So there are cases like this. But commerce is much more likely as the source of Phoebe's wealth, and it's probably for that reason that she is traveling, whether it's to Ephesus or to Rome. Yes.
Well, since Corinth is right close there between
Yes.
the two ports, I guess we could speculate that when Paul first went to Corinth, he landed there, and she probably had, your second home was down there at the port, probably the first home was in Corinth.
It's a good hypothesis.
Would you repeat it, Larry?
So Paul would have arrived in Corinth via Cenchreae. He's coming from the east. Before he was in Corinth, he was in Athens, according to the book of Acts. And so he would have sailed down and entered the port at Cenchreae. Did he meet Phoebe already on the occasion of his first visit? We don't know. Later, when Paul wrote to the Corinthian Christians, Paul has some nice things to say about a man named Stephanus, whom Paul describes as the first fruits of Achaia, so his first convert. Now, does that mean he was the first convert in Roman Corinth? But Cenchreae is not part of Corinth. It's an independent city, or actually more like a town, right? Not a full-blown city, but a town. So we don't know exactly when Paul met Phoebe, but by the time he writes his great letter to the Romans, she has already been a Christian for some time, a patroness of many, and of myself as well, Paul says. These are wonderful questions. Comments? Yes.
Are there other examples of this pattern of 13 plus line that are
Good question. Good question. I don't know the answer. In Joseph Reif's book, he does point to the fact that this is not the only octagon. It's not the only memorial chapel to a great Christian figure or leader of the past. There is another one in Palestine, another octagon. But I don't remember whether the number 13 occurs in any of the foundation deposits. It's a good question. I have to read Joe Reich's book one more time. Oh yes, John.
Are there any other writings about Phoebe other than this brief mention?
No, just that one inscription from Jerusalem where a woman is praised as the second Phoebe. There is nothing else. But evidently her story and her benefaction had spread, the news of it, and persisted over time. But no other writings about Phoebe. Now, Phoebe is not the only, check my time. Oh, I'm having too much fun. Phoebe is not the only woman leader in the Pauline orbit. To stay with the letter to the Romans for just a minute, in Romans chapter 16, verse 7, Paul sends greetings to two people, Andronicus and Junia. Now, Junia is a woman. How do you know? The feminine ending of her name. Andronicus and Junia. Paul describes these two people as his kinspeople. So they are relatives of Paul's, part of Paul's larger family. He then tells us that they had been in Christ, so they were converts before me, Paul said. Yeah, they were Christ followers before Paul. And then he says about Junia that she is famous, epithemos, among the apostles. Now there's an ambiguity in the Greek. The phrase that is translated among the apostles can denote the fact that she has a great reputation. She is famous among the apostles, who are understood to be a different group. But the same Greek phrase can also indicate that she is what? A famous apostle. That she is one of them. She is famous among a group to which or of which she is a member. Isn't that interesting? I told you that in Romans chapter 16, Paul sends greetings to more than 30 people. Now, you ready for this? Almost half of the 30 who are greeted are women. Wow, that's not the picture that most people have of the early Christ movement. Almost half are women. Paul is greeting his colleagues and co-workers, and almost half of them are women. Let me mention one in particular. Paul greets a woman named Prisca and her husband named Aquila. Now, these are Latin names, Prisca and Aquila. This famous missionary couple is also mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 18, at the beginning of the chapter. Luke says that when Paul came to Corinth, he found lodging and employment with these two people, Prisca and Aquila, because they shared an occupation. They were skenopoioi. There's a big debate now among scholars about how to translate that. For many years, people just translated it as tent maker, following the etymological meaning. Skene is tent, poios is maker. But the wonderful old Lutheran, German-American editor of the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, Frederick Dayton, whose office was right next to me in Chicago. I knew him, a crusty old man, and a great lexicographer. And what he demonstrated when the Great Dictionary was revised in the year 2000 is that if you define the meaning of the word skenopoios by usage, there are no usages contemporary with the book of Acts where the word means tent maker. Instead, what does it mean? Can you guess? Scene maker, stage carpenter, prop maker, which makes a lot more sense. Paul was engaged in urban community organizing, church foundation. You don't need tents in a city, but what you have in every city where Paul worked is a huge theater. So apparently Paul, with Prisca and Aquila, were involved in making stage scenery, stage carpenter. Now, this woman, Prisca, is also mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul is writing from Ephesus to Corinth, and so he sends greetings from the ecclesia, the assembly, the church, in the house of Prisca and Aquila in Ephesus. So she and her husband are the leaders of a house church. And then finally, in Romans 16, Paul once again sends greetings, this time he's writing from Corinth to Ephesus. He sends greetings to Prisca and Aquila and the church in their house. Now, you may have noticed, as I recited those passages, that in Paul's greetings, Prisca is always mentioned what? First, before her husband, Aquila. In the book of Acts, by contrast, she is mentioned second, and Luke uses a diminutive form of her name, not the strong Latin Prisca, but rather Priscilla, which is a name people still have today, including one of Diane's staff members at the Ombudsman's office. So, another example of a woman leader at the origin of the Christian movement, Prisca. Some years ago, archaeologists in Rome discovered a catacomb. Throughout history, it had been identified as the Priscilla catacomb. Has anyone been there? You can see it. You can go see it in Rome. Inside the catacomb, there is a wall painting. And the wall painting shows a woman, Priscilla, probably, with a book in her hand. The book is open. And so scholars speculate that perhaps Priscilla was the author of one of the early Christian writings. Some people nominate Priscilla as the author of Hebrews, right? A text that is anonymous in point of fact. Yes. Comment, question. That was it. Yeah, the Priscilla catacomb. Right. Well, these are not the only women leaders in the Pauline orbit. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, Paul says that some people have arrived, hoi chloes, the people of Chloe, hoi chloes. This expression in Greek designates the people who belong to Chloe. So they're either members of her household, or her slaves, or her clients, that is, freed persons who remain financially dependent upon her. They bring Paul a report. Paul is in Ephesus, and they bring him a report that there are factions, divisions in the Christian community at Corinth. Paul is very disturbed about it. So Chloe also appears to be the leader of a Christian group, probably a house-based gathering, and she has the resources to send some of her people across the Aegean Sea from Corinth to Ephesus to report to Paul on the problem. Isn't that it? Chloe. We don't know anything more about her, except there's a French perfume named after her. But she's not the only one. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul addresses directly two women, Euodia and Syntyche. Now their names are interesting. Euodia can be translated either good fragrance, a good odor, or if Odia is a feminine form of the Greek word horos, which means road, it would mean good journey, prosperous journey. Syntiki means what? Fortunate, favored by fortune. So these are two women in the Christ group at Philippi, and they are involved in a dispute with one another. We don't know the nature of the dispute, but it is probably theological. In other words, these two women are not at home baking cookies. They are engaged in a theological debate. And Paul calls upon another Philippian named Clement, his co-worker and colleague. He says, please, why don't you try to bring these two women into agreement with one another? Help them negotiate their differences about which they are debating. I should also mention Lydia. So according to the book of Acts, when Paul arrived in Philippi, he went down to the Jewish prayer place, prosouche. It's not called a synagogue. It's called a prayer place beside the river in Philippi. And there he found a group of Greek-speaking Jews, and Paul shared with them the message of Messiah Jesus. The first believer out of that group is a woman named Lydia. And does anyone remember what is her profession? A purple dealer. A buyer and seller in purple cloth. Now, purple was the most expensive kind of garment in the first century. Why? Does anyone know? Yes, the dye it came from a sea urchin, a mollusk. Yes, that's it. It had to be extracted. So divers had to go under the water and bring up these little shellfish and squeeze the purple out of them. It was expensive to produce. And ordinary people did not have the luxury of wearing purple. Even Roman senators only had a purple stripe on their togas. So Lydia is the first century counterpart of a Gucci franchise. and she is Paul's first convert in the Christian community at Philippi. Probably so. Probably. So many people relocated for trade. Back in Acts 18, when Luke mentions Aquila and Priscilla, Luke tells us that they were Jews, Jewish Christ believers from Pontus. Does anyone know where that is? Up on the Black Sea, north of Istanbul. That they had come from Pontus, but they had most recently been in Rome. And they were expelled from Rome, along with other members of the Jewish community, by Claudius, because Claudius got tired of the riots in the Jewish community. He kicked them out of Rome. And so they moved from Rome to Corinth. It's so amazing, isn't it, to see how mobile the ancient Mediterranean was. You could grow up on the Black Sea, you could immigrate to Rome to make money, and you could relocate to Corinth. So this is quite a group of women leaders in the early Christian movement. Phoebe, Prisca, Chloe, Lydia, Junia, and other women who are just mentioned by name in the greetings of Romans 16. In just the last couple of minutes, I want to mention an anonymous group of women. In fact, the report about them is anonymous, probably to protect the people that bring the report. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 to 16, Paul addresses the case of a group of women who are praying and prophesying in the worship assembly with their heads uncovered. Or the Greek could also be translated with their hair cut, shaved. Perhaps they have removed one of the markers of their gender identity. They look more like their male counterparts. Or perhaps they had taken off the head cover that women often wore, especially from a Jewish background. In any case, whatever Paul's purpose may be or may not be in this paragraph, and scholars debate what Paul is up to, it is clear that women were praying and prophesying in the assembly, and Paul does not criticize that activity. He doesn't silence them. He only deals with the issue of the head coverings or the way that they wear their hair. Evidently, someone, probably men, were upset with the way that they looked, the markers of their gender identity. But the fact that they were praying and prophesying is interesting, isn't it? That's what Antoinette Clark Wire investigated in her breakthrough book, The Corinthian Women Prophets. All right, I know I've used up all my time. I'm sorry. Are there other questions, comments? Well, I hope you have found the discovery of the octagonal monument commemorating Phoebe as exciting as I do. And we've made a start now at retrieving the memory and understanding the importance of women leaders in the early Christian movement. Next week, we will look at women who are mentioned in the Gospels, including Mary Magdalene, and we will also look at a text called the Gospel of Mary. That was among the documents found in the Nag Hammadi Library. In the following weeks, we will then look at the beautiful account of the life and conversion of a woman named Thecla, which is part of the Acts of Paul. In week number 4, we will take a look at passages excerpted from the martyrdom of Perpetua, a woman in North Africa. And finally, our class will conclude with the beautiful biography of a woman named Macrina from Turkey, written by her younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa. It's beautiful beyond belief. Okay, thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you next Sunday. And as you know, for this course, I'm here in person every time.
Hey.
Yes. Yes. I'll tell you about one of my colleagues at Fordham who wrote, in fact, before any of these famous feminist scholars of the New Testament. My colleague at Fordham, until recently, she just retired, was the remarkable Elizabeth Johnson. Have you heard of her? She published of the very first feminist theology, and it was called She Who Is. She Who Is. And she's Catholic, grew up in Brooklyn. When she published that book, she was teaching at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C. She was brought up on charges by the what's the Catholic organization that investigates heresy? The Congregation for the Defense of the Faith. And she was prosecuted in Washington, D.C. Guess who the prosecutor was? A cardinal named Ratzinger. Right. Pope Benedict. He was exonerated. She was vindicated of heresy, but she didn't feel like she was defended and supported by her colleagues at the Catholic University in Washington. And so she accepted an offer to come to Fordham University, where she was our most famous faculty member. until she retired a couple of years ago. She came here. She was invited to lecture at the University of Dayton. She was, oh, wow. And she was given an award, and she invited Diane Welborn to be her guest.
Oh.
So Diane sat in a dining room with this powerhouse, Beth Johnson, and the rest of the room full of male.
Catholics.
And there was a heated debate about the ordination of women to the priesthood that night. Diane overheard the whole debate, Beth Johnson arguing. Beth Johnson also wrote a really good book on New Testament theology on Mary, which is worth reading. And of course, her classic is the book She Who Is. I'll just tell you a quick little story. I don't know if the class is finished, but when I was first invited to consider a professorship at Fordham, of course, I went there to see if I would fit, and they were checking me out, Protestant, to see if I would fit at a Jesuit university. Beth Johnson, a matriarch of the theology department, invited me to have dinner with her in her beautiful apartment in Bronxville. She is a sister of St. Joseph. This is the feminine Jesuits. And she is a fantastic Provençal cook. So that night she cooked for me the most amazing Provençal stew. And I noticed darting around her apartment was a cat. And I complimented Beth on the cat. And I said, what's the cat's name? And she said, the cat is named She Who Is Not. Why? Because someone gave her the cat. They thought the cat was a female. It discovered that it needed to be. Cat named it alluding to her. Is not. She had so much. She published a book on religious, interreligious plurality and diversity, arguing that there was a legitimate experience of God beyond the boundaries of Christianity. In Southeast Asian religions, in Islam, and elsewhere. And she was attacked by conservative Catholics from Long Island. One of them sent her death threats through the mail that were brought by someone and put in her faculty box at Fordham. And so one of the finest police officers from New York City was assigned as a bodyguard to Beth Johnson for a whole semester. She was escorted to the campus and back to her work. Yes.
There's a little bit of the structure of the Catholic University, as you pointed out, that Fordham is Jesuit.
Yes.
Catholic University in Washington is diocesan, correct?
Right.
And the University of Dayton is Marianist, which is a very conservative side of the Catholic Church. And so it's very interesting that they were giving her an award, but not surprising that they would have had a debate about the ordination of women.
Right.
But the idea of moving after her charge of heresy from a diocesan university to a Jesuit university, the joke is that Catholic Jesuits aren't really Catholic, so that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, they're the most progressive, the most open to other ideas. Many of them are scientists, scholars, and so forth. Do you know how long you have to study? It's the best educated, even more better educated than Lutheran and Presbyterian. The period of time you have to go through coursework to be a Jesuit priest, 12 years. 12. And the first course is not in theology, it's in philosophy. Philosophy. So the Jesuits are a very well educated group.
The Pope's a Jesuit, right?
He is.
Yes.
The first Jesuit ever. Yeah, they were sort of outsiders.
But that's what the joke is that Jesuits aren't really Catholics.
Thank you all so much. I'm sorry I kept you here too long.
Well, thank
I
you.
hope I didn't keep anybody from.
Working.
Thank you very much.